2020, I believe God pushed me in a different direction. So we're going to focus on the idea of fear today, and then our response as Christians. So, we had a lot of talk, a lot of stuff. This seems like a week where something new's popping up every week, and I know being at the school with the teachers is always this talk, what are they going to do? Are we going to close school? Are we shutting down? What's the plan? And a lot of people living in fear. A lot of people around the world struggling to be afraid. And I think even more so in our sort of modern culture, just kind of thinking back through history, whenever something big like this pops up, it hasn't always been as big of a deal, but now with social media, everybody's talking about it. Everyone has a theory. Everyone has some conspiracy they want to share. Everyone's got something going on, and that panic and fear just seems to spread like wildfire. Well, fear is a common thing that we as humanity deal with, whether it's now the coronavirus, whether it's the fear of death, a fear of certain situations. We're afraid of individuals. We're afraid for our children, for our families. Fear is something that we are faced with on a regular basis. It's not something that just popped up now as we're talking about coronavirus or whatever the new global catastrophe is. But there's always something in there causing us to be afraid. And this isn't something new. As you look back and I studied through this week, looking at the lives of people through Scripture, David talks about being afraid. Over and over in the Psalms, when he's afraid, when he's filled with worry and anxiety. Elijah was afraid. You look throughout history, this is something that's been common to all mankind ever since the fall. Since our world is broken, we live in a messed up world full of sin, full of death, disease, destruction. Our world's broken. And so our body has this reaction to protect ourselves. So we have this fear to protect us from all the dangers and all the evil in this world. So with all these things to be afraid of, with so many things facing us on a regular basis, the question then is for us, how do we as Christians respond to fear? Right? Because we know, and as the Bible has pointed out as believers, we're here to be set apart from the world. Right? We've talked about that. We've studied that as Christians. We're here to be different. When the world sees the way that we live, when the world sees the way that we talk, the way that we interact with each other, the way we interact with the world, there's supposed to be something different about us so that we are drawing people to God in the way that we live. So when it comes to our response to fear, how do we as Christians react? And then what does that look like as we go forward from here? So we're going to look back at an example in the Old Testament. If you have your Bible, we're going to be in the book of 2 Chronicles. Again, not a book that we often spend a lot of time in. Usually, you're going through the Bible, you're reading through. Sometimes, we read through Samuel, we read through Kings, and then Chronicles seems like it's repeating a lot of stuff, so we just skip right on by it. But we're going to be in the book of 2 Chronicles today, starting with chapter 19. And we're going to be looking for a godly response to fear. How do we respond when we feel afraid? And we talk about fear. We're not going to focus on any one fear because we all feel fear of different things. We don't all have the same fears. We don't have all the same worries or concerns or anxieties. It all looks differently for each one of us, but the response is the same. How we react to that should be the same. All right, in chapter 19, now a little bit of a background here. We're going to be looking at the nation of Israel. Now, at this point in history, we had a few kings of Israel. We had King Saul, we had King David, we had King Solomon. And then after Solomon, the people began to reject and turn away because of Solomon's sin, turning away from what God had called them to do. So the nation of Israel was broken up into two parts. We had the northern kingdom of Israel, and we had the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, up in the northern kingdom, we had the top 10 tribes there of Israel, and every single leader of them had turned away from God. They didn't have one king, one leader who led them in proper worship of God. So what ended up happening there? The people just did whatever they felt like. They worshipped other gods. They worshipped God however they wanted to. They put up, remember like when at Mount Sinai, when Moses went up to get the Ten Commandments, what were the people doing down at the base? What did they build? A golden calf. They did the same thing up again in the northern kingdom of Israel. They put up these golden calves and said, this is God. You know, they fell into the exact same sin. So the top 10 tribes, all their leaders were turning away from God. And because of that, the people turned away from God. Now, in the southern kingdom of Judah, we had some kings who followed God and some kings who didn't. They kind of went back and forth, kind of flip-flopped. Kind of like our political process, you know, Republican, Democrat. You know, it's like the leader who followed God, and then someone who didn't, and someone who did, and someone who didn't. Well, right now in the northern kingdom, we have this evil king, Ahab, and his wife, Jezebel. And they're turning the people's hearts away from God, bringing in worship of Baal and all these other pagan gods. In the southern kingdom, we have a king with a very funny name, Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat seems funny to us, would have been very normal back then. But for us, we have Ahab and Jehoshaphat. So Ahab turned away from God, so God was judging him. He said, you know, I'm going to stop protecting you. You guys aren't following me. You're not worshiping me. So God says, I'm stepping back. And all these other nations begin to gather together to go after Ahab. Now, he is being judged for his sin. Now, Jehoshaphat, the king in Judah, is trying to follow God. He has the right heart, but he compromises. A lot like us sometimes. Sometimes we have the right heart, we want to do the right thing, we're really trying, but then, we make little compromises here and there. We begin to fall away. And that's what happened with Jehoshaphat. He made an alliance with Ahab, went up, almost got killed because of it, and was working with Ahab, trying to help protect him. Well, eventually Ahab, he is killed by the enemy. They're sort of wiped out. And now here we are, and that's where we pick up in 2 Chronicles chapter 19. So I'm going to read the first 3 verses, and then we'll kind of pick piece by piece as we go through here. Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, returned to his home in Jerusalem in peace. And then Jehu, son of Hananiah, the seer, or the prophet, went out to confront Jehoshaphat, and said to King Jehoshaphat, do you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Because of this, the Lord's wrath is on you. However, some good is found in you, for you have removed the Asherah poles from the land and have decided to seek God. So, Jehoshaphat gets called up by the prophet because he was not leading his people in the way that he should. And he was joining in with his wicked friend, King Ahab. It's kind of like a situation I tell my students. I had a situation even this week with some of my students. One kid got in trouble, and he's like, well, it wasn't me, it was them. I was like, well, you're hanging out with them. You're with them. You're part of that crowd. You're going to face the same judgment that they are, right? You're joining along with them. You may not have been the one to do it, but you have allied yourself with those who were doing wrong. That's what Jehoshaphat's doing. So now Jehoshaphat's in trouble. Let's read the beginning of chapter 20. We're going to skip a little section here. Beginning of chapter 20. After this, the Moabites, the Ammonites, together with some of the Meunites, came to fight against Jehoshaphat. Now, because Jehoshaphat wasn't leading his people, he wasn't doing what God commanded, he's finding himself in the same trouble that Ahab did. Now all the enemies have joined together, and they're coming after him, and they're coming after his people. People came and told Jehoshaphat, a vast number from beyond the Dead Sea and from Edom has come to fight against you. They are ready in Hazazon Tamar, that is, En-Gedi. And Jehoshaphat was afraid, and he resolved to seek the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast for all Judah, who gathered to seek the Lord. They even came from all the cities of Judah to seek him. Let's keep going. Then Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah in Jerusalem in the Lord's temple before the new courtyard, and he said, Yahweh, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? And do you not rule over the kingdoms of the nations? Power and might are in your hand, and no one can stand against you. Are you not our God who drove out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel, and who gave it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? They have lived in the land and have built you a sanctuary in it for your name, and have said, if disaster comes on us, sword or judgment, pestilence or famine, we will stand before this temple and before you, and for your name is in this temple. We will cry out to you because of our distress, and you will hear and deliver. Now, here are the Ammonites and the Moabites and the inhabitants of Mount Seir. You did not let Israel invade them when Israel came out of the land of Egypt, but Israel turned away from them and did not destroy them. Look how they repay us by coming to drive us out of your possession that you gave us as an inheritance. Our God, will you not judge them? For we are powerless before this vast number that comes to fight against us. We do not know what to do, but we look to you. So Jehoshaphat gets himself in trouble. The people of his country have been turning away from God. He has not been leading well. And now they're faced with this situation where all the surrounding nations have joined together to destroy them. Right? Now we feel fear. We're looking at, the viruses. We look at the problems in our life. Here we see Jehoshaphat. Imagine you're in his place, looking out at the surrounding enemies who are coming to destroy you. They want to kill you, kill your family, and all your people. Right? Now there's fear. It says Jehoshaphat was afraid. Jehoshaphat was afraid. So, what we're looking for today was what was his response? Because I think it was very powerful, and it sets an excellent precedent for us. When we are faced with fear, how do we respond? What do we do? So fear set in. Verse 3 of chapter 20. Jehoshaphat was afraid. Here's a king. He's afraid. He sees the enemy. He sees the incoming doom and destruction for him and his people. So what is his response? First thing, he resolved to seek the Lord. I think the first response is one of resolution. When fear sets in, a lot of times it's easy to, we get frozen. We want to distract ourselves. We give in to our fear. And sometimes we're going everywhere and looking everywhere except looking to God. When you get to that moment of fear, it's often difficult to think clearly, right? You're a little bit more distracted. It's harder to focus. It's harder to think through it. It's harder to think rationally about what's going on. You just feel afraid and you don't know what to do with it. And that feeling of fear can so easily overtake you that you feel frozen. So when that fear set in for Jehoshaphat, what did he do? He resolved himself. That means he set himself in this direction. The first thing he did, he says, I am going to seek the Lord. What do we do when we feel afraid? When that fear sets in, when that worry begins to overtake us, when we feel anxious, when we feel upset and we don't know where to go, what's our first thing that we do? I think this is something that doesn't always come naturally. We had to work on it. We sometimes have to just say, it's like, I am going to seek the Lord. In this, no matter how I feel right now, no matter how afraid I am, no matter how worried I am in this situation, I am going to seek the Lord. David set us an example in Psalm 56. I just wanted to read this real quick. Psalm 56, verses 1 through 4. And this is a point in David's life where his life was in danger. His enemies had taken him. He was not sure if he was going to die or not. And he says, be gracious to me, God, for man tramples me. He fights and oppresses me all day long. My adversaries trample me all day, for many arrogantly fight against me. But when I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I will not fear. What can man do to me? First step, when we feel afraid, when we feel worried, when that begins to set in, what do? We need to resolve ourselves that I'm going to God. no matter how I feel in this moment, no matter how I'm struggling in this moment, no matter how much it seems like my world is just collapsing in on me in this moment, I am going to seek God. And in that moment, it may not feel better right away. As you're reading the Word, as you're studying, as you're praying, you may not feel better right away. But God has promised that He will be with you. He is our rock when times are difficult, when the waves around us are closing in, when it feels like, we are struggling. God is the one who is the rock, is our fortress. He is our salvation. And as David said, as he was captured by the Philistines, not knowing if he was going to be killed or not, he says, what can man do to me? What can my enemies do? They have no power over God. And that's where we need to recognize that our God is the one with the power. No matter what the situation is, the God that we serve is so much bigger than whatever we are struggling with, whatever we are afraid of. Our God is infinitely more powerful and infinitely more caring about you and your situation than anyone else or anything else you're going through. As Jehoshaphat is calling on God, or he is resolving himself to seek God, he is recognizing that God not only is powerful, but he cares for his people. We recognize God is strong enough to deal with any situation that we are going through, but he also cares about the situation that we're going through. So where do we turn when our fear sets in? Do we resolve ourselves that we are going to seek God no matter what? Because only in him will we find hope, or will we find peace in our fears and in our worries. So first thing he does, he was afraid and he resolved, we are going to seek God. No matter what, we are going to seek him. And then what does he do? He proclaims a fast for all Judah who gathered to seek the Lord. So he and all the people. So as they fasted, we probably have some idea of what fasting is. It's not something we often do, perhaps. Some do more than others. Fasting is usually, in a biblical context, you set aside food, you don't eat, they would gather and they would just pray. And they would pray and they would seek God's direction. Remove all distractions, everything else they were doing, work was put to the side, food was put to the side, anything they would normally do would be put to the side. They would gather and they would pray. And they would seek the Lord. The idea of fasting is where you remove the distractions and you set your focus on God and God alone. Fasting was a practice of demonstrating complete dependence on God. So as Jehoshaphat is resolving, I'm going to seek the Lord, first thing he does is fast. He says, everything else is out, putting everything to the side. All we need right now to get through this is God. No matter what's going on around us, no matter what we're feeling in this moment, no matter what fear, no matter how big our enemy is out there, how big the problem is, all we need is God. And fasting was where they set aside and they said, we are putting everything away and we're going to put our focus and our trust in God. Now, I was actually talking a little bit about fasting this week with some co-workers who are Catholic, and you go through Lent and you choose something that you set aside, and you have something you put to the side, and it's more like this, people kind of pump up and they say, well, look at me, I'm not going to eat this for a month, or I'm not going to do this for a month, and I'm going to do this for a month. But it's not to focus on God, it's just something you go through the motions, you feel like you have to do. It kind of got that way for Israel as well. Israel began to go through the motion with fasting as they went on. It was more of like, hey, look at me. I didn't eat for 1 week. And the guy says, look at me. I didn't eat for 2 weeks. I'm better than this guy. I can fast a lot more than this guy can. And they actually got called out for it. They got called out in Isaiah chapter 58. And I want to read that because when we think about fasting today, I want to make a couple points. But let's first look at what God says. So God is, in chapter 58, is calling out Israel, saying, you guys, you're fasting, but your life isn't changing. You're not looking to me. It's not even about me. You're just going through it to show how righteous you are, or trying to make a show about how holy you are. Some churches, that happens. We sort of make ourselves up, well, I did this, or I gave this amount, or I fasted this long. And so it's more about ourselves, and it's not about God. And so in Isaiah 58, God calls them out, and he says, what is the fast? Or isn't the fast that I choose this? What is the fast type of fasting that God has accepted? To break the chains of wickedness, and untie the ropes of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, to tear off every chain. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry? Is it not to bring the poor and the homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood? Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. At that time, when you call, the Lord will answer. When you cry out, he will say, here I am. If you get rid of the yoke among you, the finger pointing, the malicious speaking, and instead you offer yourself to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted one, then your light will shine in the darkness, and your night will be like noonday. Fasting was an opportunity to refocus themselves from our desires and our kingdom to refocus on God's will, God's desires, to focus on his kingdom. What is God wanting me to do? This is something we don't do enough of. We go through our day, we get busy, we get focused, and we get distracted. And the more distracted we are, the less we're praying, the less we're spending time with God, and the more susceptible we are to the worries, to the fears of this world. The more susceptible we are to fall into the traps this world has to offer, to begin to struggle with our own sin, with our own guilt, to struggle with our fears and the worries and the cares of this world. And what God was saying to Israel there in Isaiah, he's saying, when you fast, it's an opportunity for you to turn away from your will, from your kingdom, to making it about you, to looking at what is important to God. What was important to God? To proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to set the prisoner free, to share with the homeless, with the hungry, with those who are hurting, with those who are struggling, providing for people. Fasting in Scripture was not a specific command to say, you need to stop eating for this long. Fasting was an opportunity for the people to say, I need to make sure my life, my will, is aligned with what God wants. And when we do that, those fears begin to go away. Because our life isn't about what we're worried about, or what we're thinking about, or what we're hoping to accomplish. My life is now about, what does God want? What does God want for me to do? What does God? He wants me to proclaim good news. He wants me to share the truth with people. He wants me to feed the hungry. He wants me to take care of the poor and the homeless and those who are hurting. When we realign our purpose, when we change our focus so it's no longer on us, it's on what God's doing, then the fear begins to go away, because we recognize this isn't our kingdom. This is not my world. I'm here as a traveler. I'm here as an ambassador. I'm here working for God. He'll take care of that stuff. First thing Jehoshaphat does, he resolves himself. He says, we need to seek God. I'm afraid. I'm scared for my life. I'm going to focus my life on God. Then what does he do? He fasts. Let's realign our vision. Let's realign our purpose to make sure